we can capture your name and phone number so we can capture your participation. Time and attendance will be monitored for CEU certificates as requirements dictate full participation. At this time, I would like to introduce Richard Kennedy, our Executive Director, to share a few words. Richard?
Thank you, Christy. Good morning, everyone. As Christy said, my name is Richard Kennedy, and I have the great privilege to serve as the Executive Director of the Tennessee Commission on Children and Youth. The Tennessee Commission on Children and Youth is a statewide children's advocacy organization. Our vision is that all children in Tennessee are safe, healthy, educated, nurtured and supported, and engaged in activities that provide them opportunities to achieve their fullest potential. The mission of the Commission is to advocate to improve the quality of life for children and families and to provide leadership and support for child advocates. We do this through a variety of areas, ranging from a young child wellness council focused on those issues and needs of the very youngest Tennesseans, all the way through a youth transitions advisory council focused on improving outcomes for young folks transitioning from the foster care juvenile justice system into adulthood. We're involved with children's mental health, early childhood education, juvenile justice, and a range of issues impacting children, young people, and families in Tennessee. As Christy said, we are very fortunate that we have 9 regional councils on children and youth across the state, 1 in each of the 9 development districts, and we have a full-time staff person or coordinator in each of those regions that convene children's advocates for a variety of purposes, one of which is education, to continue to share information, best practices, and provide resources for folks in their community. As we're facing and living through these new times for us with COVID-19, we continue to think about how can we best support our council members and those of you who are providing supports and services for children and families. Historically, the regional councils with their learning opportunities have been in person and in their regions. And by partnering together, they've realized and are undertaking a new effort to bring training online so that we can impact and reach folks from all across the state, from Memphis to Mountain City, from Union City to Ducktown. So I'm very appreciative of their ingenuity and flexibility during these uncertain times. The last thing that I would want to leave with you guys is that I've, like many of you, have been trying to find silver linings in all of the way that we've had to change and adapt and be nimble to support children and young people. And so I wanted to just personally say thank you for everything that you all are doing, whether it's continuing to do therapy or support families through telehealth measures, whether you're a teacher or an educator and you're just reaching out to your students to call them in person, whether you're an intake worker in a child abuse center or anything like that at all. Just thank you so much, in case no one has told you that over the weekend or to start your week. And I know many of you probably spend as much time on social media as I do, but I am very much reminded of Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers quote during this time. And the quote is, "When I was a boy and I would see scary things in the news, my mother would say to me, 'Look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping.' To this day, especially in times of disaster, I remember my mother's words, and I'm always comforted by realizing that there are still so many helpers, so many caring people in this world. So today, I would like for you all to count yourself as those helpers, and for me personally to thank you for everything that you're doing. So my real job today is to introduce our speaker. And so it is definitely my pleasure to introduce to you all Heather Herman. Heather is the statewide domestic violence fatality review coordinator with the Metro Nashville Office of Family Safety. She is a wonderful person and a great presenter, and I am certain you all are going to find very valuable information in what she offers. So Heather, thank you for taking the time to be with us again, and I will turn things over to you.
Thank you, Richard. I appreciate that. I thank everyone for being on the line this morning. I know that with all the storms that came through the state last night, people may be struggling a little bit this morning, and Mondays are always difficult, so I thank you for being here. A quick, just in case you already sat through that one, you're more than welcome to sit through it again, but I just wanted to give you a heads up about that. But our training tomorrow afternoon will be some different topics, so I hope that you'll be able to join us for that one as well. So as Richard said, my name is Heather Herman. I am Tennessee's statewide Domestic Violence Fatality Review Coordinator. I work out of Metro Nashville's Office of Family Safety, although my work is statewide. Metro's Office of Family Safety is a department of Metro government, just like Parks is a department or the Health Department. Our office coordinates Metro Nashville's response to domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, and human trafficking. We also operate 2 family safety centers or family justice centers in Nashville. One is a court-based center, the Jean Crow Advocacy Center, and the other one is a community-based center called the Family Safety Center. And out of the Family Safety Center, we host the Department of Children's Services, their investigative unit for Nashville, as well as the Nashville Children's Alliance, which is the Child Advocacy Center of Nashville. And the beauty of a family justice center is that it houses multiple community agencies who are working together to deal with issues of domestic violence, sexual assault, child abuse, all under one roof. So if a victim or a family comes in needing help, they can receive advocacy, help with things like orders of protection, housing, food insecurity, but they can also talk to their caseworkers with DCS, they can speak to a counselor, they can work with domestic violence shelter staff to get emergency housing, and many other things all under one roof. So it's a wonderful agency, and if you want to hear more about either of our centers or my office in general and the many projects that we do, my contact information will be later on in the presentation, and you are more than welcome to contact me at any time to chat about that stuff or about anything, any questions or information that you want more detail on from the presentation today. So today's topic, we are really going to focus in on the impacts of domestic violence on family systems and the impact of domestic violence on primarily the relationship between children and their non-offending parents. We are going to dig deeply into the complex ways in which an abuser's behavior is woven into the daily life of a family and identify some of the ways that abusers exert control through manipulating the bond between the non-offending parent and the child. So why this topic? What makes this topic so important? First of all, 7 million children at a low estimate are exposed to domestic violence every year. Domestic violence is perpetrated at higher rates against women who are mothers than against other women. We often say that there are 2 times in a victim's life that are the most dangerous, that they are at the highest risk of being killed by their abuser. And that is number 1, when they're leaving, when they're in the process of leaving the abuser, and number 2 is when they're pregnant. Children exposed to domestic violence are at higher risks of experiencing co-occurring physical and sexual abuse. And about 1/5 of domestic violence homicides includes a child victim also being killed. And one of the big things that we're going to talk about later in this presentation is the fact that abusers are more likely the non-offending parents to seek sole or primary custody of children. Tennessee specifically sees over half of our residents in domestic violence shelters are under the age of 18, living in shelter with a non-offending parent or family member. Children in violent households have up to 60% chance of experiencing other co-occurring child abuse, and they witness up to 80% of domestic violence incidents in their household. Often when we work with adult victims, one of the things that they commonly say is, you know, I shield my child as much as I can. We don't fight in front of them. They don't know what's happening in the home. And what we know is that although these non-offending parents have the child's best interest at heart and they're trying their best to shield the child from what's happening, children see and overhear and understand much, much more than we think they do. They are, they're tiny little experts at looking at body language, at tone, because they're absorbing all of that and learning how to interpret it. So they see much more than we think they see. So one thing that I want your all's opinion on as we get started is, do you believe that abusers are only different than non-abusive parents when they're being violent, or do you believe that they are different all the time? So do you think that during violent outbursts, obviously we know that during violent outbursts, abusers in a home are going to be very different than non-offending parents, but do you think that's the only time that they're different? So I'm going to give a minute or two for you all to share in the chat box what you think, what your opinion is, and then we'll spend the rest of our presentation kind of digging into it. Again, I'll give you a minute to type and let me know what you think.
Heather,
Yes,
could you repeat the question, please?
of course. So do you believe that abusers or parents who abuse their intimate partner parent differently only when they're being violent? That's kind of what we're drilling down to. Do you think that the differences in parenting between offending parents and non-offending parents is only a difference of one is violent and one is not? And remember to put your answers in the chat box, not the Q&A box.
Heather, would you like me to start sharing some of those? Or can you see those?
Absolutely.
Several no's. I think there are differences, different all the time. Different when the abuse is happening. I'm guessing they display other behaviors outside of the times they are violent as well. I think they are different in every way. There is always manipulation of some type, even if it is during the honeymoon period. Always different after always manipulating, even when not displaying physical violence. They may not always be violent, but they could be mean, have control, treat the children differently. They are often manipulative and controlling all of the time. the perpetrator's pattern of behavior is all the time manifested in different ways.
Yeah, lots of great answers. And I see that more are rolling in, and I really appreciate, you know, all of the answers and all of the thought that you all are putting in. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what an abuser's parenting style looks like outside of that physical violence as we go forward. So many of you may be already familiar with the power and control wheel, which is on the screen right now. For those of you who are not familiar, I want to give you a little bit of background. So the power and control wheel was created out of Duluth, Minnesota, out of the Domestic Violence Intervention and Abuse Program. And they were one of the first batterers intervention programs in the country. So they were one of the first programs that operated court-mandated batterers intervention curricula. And alongside that, when they first started out, they were also doing a support group for the victims of the batterers that were in their course. And so as the support group progressed, what they started to see was that many of the tactics and the types of control and abuse that were coming up in conversation among all the various victims were similar. They may be kind of the same goal using different tactics. So for instance, using isolation. Almost all abusers in some way or another use isolation against their victim, just maybe a different tactic. While one abuser may entirely isolate their victim from the outside world and keep them home almost 100% of the time, another victim or another abuser may limit isolation to, for instance, preventing the victim from getting a job, or preventing the victim from talking to certain friends who disapprove of the relationship. So all of these are using isolation, they're just using isolation in slightly different ways. So as they started talking to the women in the support group, they found out that there were a set of common tactics that perpetrators were using against their victims to maintain this power and control that you see at the center of the wheel, to maintain their control over the victim, and they were just using those tactics in just slightly different ways. And one of the really big ones you can see included on the wheel is using children. Now, before I dig deeper into using children, I do want to mention and to point out that, as you can see, physical and sexual violence, violence altogether, is only on kind of this dark black rung on the outside of the wheel. But none of the tactics on the inside of the wheel necessarily include physical violence. In fact, most of them don't. And the reason for that is, as many of you pointed out when you answered the question, there are a lot of tactics, there are a lot of ways that a person can be abusive that don't necessarily include violence. And so when we're talking about the ways that abusers use children, that can include things like making the victim feel guilty about the children, that they're not a good enough parent, that they're not doing enough, that they've done something wrong with the children. That can include using the children to relay messages, particularly in times of separation, using the children to spy unintentionally, unknowingly to spy on the non-offending parent, using visitation to harass the victim, threatening to seek full custody or kidnap the children or somehow take the children away as a method of keeping the victim from leaving. If you leave me, I'm going to take the children, and therefore the victim will stay longer out of fear of the children being taken away. So all of this, all of everything that we're going to talk about today can really be kind of boiled down to this ripple effect of violence in the home. So one of the things that I like to talk about in terms of violent behaviors is this sort of metaphor of throwing a rock in a pond. If I am standing on the edge of a pond and I throw a rock into the pond, the rock will hit the water and cause the water to ripple out in all directions, and eventually those ripples will hit the shore. And you can see in that moment, and even for several minutes after I throw the rock, you can see exactly where the rock hit the water. You can see exactly what the cause and the effect of these ripples is. But eventually, the surface of the water will calm, it will go still, and if you were to come up after the surface goes still, you would have no idea that I threw a rock into the pond at all. And you might say, yeah, I mean, you threw a rock, but everything's fine now. But the rock is still in the pond. The rock has fundamentally changed the pond. You might be able to see it anymore after the ripples die down. But the rock has fundamentally changed the pond. And if I continue throwing more and more and more rocks, eventually they will build up to such a point that even when the ripples stop, you will still be able to see the effect of the rocks on the pond, whether they tower up together and make an island of rocks in the center of the pond, whether they form a line and kind of a natural dam down the center of the pond that changes the shape of the pond. You will be able to see whether there are ripples or not. And so in this case, when I'm talking about rocks, I am talking about an incident of violence. And that doesn't have to be physical violence. It can be emotional. It can be mental abuse. It can be threats. It can be violence against pets. It can be throwing or destroying things in the home, but an incident of domestic violence has a ripple effect that does not end just because you can't see its impact. So domestic violence, first of all, impacts that abuser's day-to-day interactions with a non-offending partner. That non-offending partner is then always going to be on edge. They are always going to be waiting in the back of their mind for the next shoe to drop, for the next trigger of violence with that perpetrator. Now, a couple of people in their responses mentioned a honeymoon period. And so if you're familiar with what is sometimes called the cycle of violence, you will know that the cycle of violence includes a violent incident followed by what is called a honeymoon period, where the abuser apologizes, swears it'll never happen again, draws the victim back in by being very sweet, very loving, by often minimizing or deferring blame for the incident, which is then followed by a state of tension building, walking on eggshells, fear building, and then another explosion of violent incident. And what we know now that we didn't really understand when we created that so-called wheel of violence or cycle of violence. And what many, many victims will say is that the honeymoon period at a certain point is only a honeymoon for the perpetrator, because the victim always knows it's going to happen again, and that's always in the back of their mind. And so all of that pressure, all of that fear will impact the abuser's parenting and the victim's parenting. And that impact on the parenting creates disordered attachment in the child. Children are predisposed to love and to seek love and affirmation from their caregivers. And when that attachment, when that love and affirmation seeking is mixed in with these periods of explosive anger or violence, that attachment becomes very disordered. And that can then impact their attachment with their extended family and community, either withdrawing entirely from making attachments with other adults and trusted individuals, or seeking unhealthy levels of attachment from inappropriate adults or individuals with authority within their communities. There is also isolation that comes along with this. Remember when I was talking about the power and control wheel, I mentioned that isolation is common amongst almost every abuser. Many times isolation comes from the threat that if you tell someone what's happening, they'll take you away, or I'll go to jail, or we'll get in trouble, or the police will come and get you, or everyone hates us, everyone's out to get us. You can't tell anyone about what's happening in our home because then they'll destroy everything. And that fosters a very real fear and mistrust of authority. And then altogether, you have adverse childhood experiences and a general impact on future relationships as the child grows older. And we're going to talk about all of these things in more detail as we move forward. But one note that I do want to make is that we often speak, when we're talking about families and children exposed to domestic violence, we often speak as if domestic violence is an entity unto itself. Children are exposed to this nebulous sort of monster under the bed called domestic violence, when in reality, what we are speaking about is children exposed to abusers. So, the mind develops as the brain responds to ongoing experience. So there's this idea that what fires together wires together. And what that means is that as a child grows and as their brains develop, as they learn and make connections in the world around them in terms of cause and effect and try to make meaning in the world, neurons in their brain are firing all the time. And when they link cause and effect, when those neurons fire together, they create patterns and pathways in your mind. So for instance, a very simple thing that children might learn is that when their dog starts barking at the door, that means they want to go outside, right? That's a very simple, barking means outside instance. But when children are in a violent or chaotic or neglectful environment, those things are also creating pathways. Those experiences are teaching the child what to expect as they grow. And that is not to say that the pathways that are created can't be changed or that there is not healing available. There obviously is, but what's important to note is that the longer someone is in an environment that is maladaptive, that is violent, that is neglectful, that is chaotic, the more difficult it is and the longer it takes to retrain and rewire those pathways. And so many of those pathways are impacted by what we call adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. Most of you are probably experienced and familiar with the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. This is a study about the physical, long-term health impacts of adverse childhood experiences on adults. And in the original study, almost 2/3 of participants reported at least one adverse childhood experience, and more than 1/5 reported 3 or more ACEs. In the United States, over 50% of men and women report exposure to at least one lifetime traumatic event. And folks who are seeking behavioral health care, 90% of those who have experienced some kind of trauma. So my office, one of our many projects, is a program called RISE, R-I-S-E. It is a prison-based education program for women in prison that teaches things like emotional regulation, healthy relationships and attachment, wellness skills, things like that. And it's a relatively new program. It's been around for about 3 years, and we've seen about somewhere between 6 and 8 classes of women go through the program in that time. And one of the first things our wonderful facilitator, Bree, does with the women who go through the program is administer the ACE quiz to see what everybody's ACE score is. And the average ACE score in this class among women in this course is 9 out of 11, which means that average woman in this course has experienced 9 adverse childhood experiences. And those are everything from witnessing abuse and violence in the home to having a parent who was in jail or had severe mental health issues or was on drugs and alcohol. And so we know that not only do adverse childhood experiences affect our mental and physical health, they also make us more likely to commit acts that would end up in prison. And so lots of very real and very long-term impacts of adverse childhood experiences. And the negative impacts of domestic violence or intimate partner violence in particular begins very early in the child's relationship with the caregiver. Negative impacts begin well before outward expressions of those impacts are noted. So typically, and a bit stereotypically, when we think of children who are impacted by domestic violence, we may think of children who are potentially regressive, so children who are starting to wet the bed again, children who are having nightmares, night terrors, children who are acting out or getting into fights in school, children who are being violent and aggressive. And the reality is children who are impacted by domestic violence within their homes have a wide range of ways that they express and deal with that impact. So you may have that kind of typical or stereotypical child who is acting out, who is getting into fights in school, who is disruptive or not listening in class. But you may also have a child who is very meek and quiet in school, who never ever gets in trouble, who just kind of keeps their head down, and you might peg them as a shy child. You may have children who are overachievers, who are obsessive with their grades, who get very upset if they get anything below an A, who are kind of the perfect student. And we'll talk more about how these behaviors manifest. But it is very hard to ascribe one specific set of outward behaviors to a child who's experiencing this chaos in the home. And again, the internal impacts of violence in the home begin well before any external expressions are noticed. And one thing that is important to understand about perpetrators before we begin digging into kind of the ways in which they maintain control within these relationships is that many, if not most, perpetrators believe that violence by men against women, so in this case we're specifically talking about male perpetrators, believe that violence by men against partners is much more common than it actually is. They believe that sexual violence against partners is 6 to 10% more common than it is. That behaviors like slapping, choking, kicking are 15% more common than they actually are. So one of the reasons that some of the manipulation that we are going to talk about and some of the control that we're going to talk about moving forward is so effective is that these perpetrators truly believe that they're doing nothing wrong, and that even if it is wrong, everyone else is doing it too. So domestic violence is inherently destructive to the authority of the non-offending parent because abusers, by and large, intentionally undermine, devalue, and interfere with their victim's parenting. Not only do they intentionally undermine the victim's parenting, but often they intentionally or unintentionally provide a model for children of enacting aggressive and contemptuous behavior toward the non-offending parent. So, for instance, they may model this behavior. And so they're not necessarily intentionally teaching the child to be aggressive toward the non-offending parent, but they are providing a model, and children are sponges. But they may go so far as to egg on and convince or even order a child to be aggressive, disrespectful, or contemptuous toward the other parent. And I do want to make a very quick note. Many of the quotes that you are going to see on the screen throughout this presentation assume a male perpetrator and a female victim. I do want to make an important note that we know that while that is the most common dynamic among intimate partner violence, it is certainly not the only dynamic among intimate partner violence, and there are female perpetrators. There are intimate partner violence that is enacted in same gender relationships. And so many of these quotes reflect a conversation about male abusers and female victims, but that is not the only dynamic that exists. So, overall, regardless of what other tactics are used, regardless of what other methods occur within the relationship, intimate partner violence in a home creates a context in which the abused parent, the non-offending parent, availability and predictability to the child are jeopardized. So if you are a parent or if you work closely with children, which I know many of you do, you know that children are creatures of routine and habit, and they want things around them to be predictable. They have not yet developed enough to really be able to understand or function in a hectic, chaotic environment, and definitely have not developed enough to be abstract thinkers. So they want a routine, they want predictability, and even if there is something going on that's special or different or outside the norm, they want to know the details. So if you have ever, for instance, said, you know, surprise, we're going to go get ice cream. They want to know, oh, where are we going? When are we going? What kind of ice cream? What are we going to do after? Where is the place? They want to know all of the details because they're little sponges and they're absorbing all this and they want to understand. And just by the very nature of abuse, it prevents the non-offending parent from being able to create and maintain a predictable routine because they're always, again, on edge, always waiting for that next outburst of abusive behavior, always trying to placate the abuser, always kind of recovering from the last episode of violence. And so they cannot be that predictable, available person that the child needs. In addition to that, remember the power and control wheel. Remember the central point of that wheel was the idea of power and control. Well, that doesn't end with the adult victim. Perpetrators are very commonly inordinately and extraordinarily controlling with children, with pets, with any person or thing that they see as their possession. So after children are born, a range of decisions about how they are to be treated, fed, trained, educated may fall increasingly under the batterer's control, even if the batterer themselves is only contributing a very tiny portion of the labor. And this control kind of falls on a continuum. On one end, you may have a perpetrator who sees the child as a part of their public persona and as a part of their image that has to be maintained. And so they are incredibly controlling about the child always behaving perfectly, the child always looking perfect, the child always getting the perfect grades, the child doing those specific extracurricular and after-school activities that reflect well on the batterer. To a degree, that is both damaging and dangerous, because we know very good and well that children, any human, but particularly children, do not have the ability to be constantly quiet and meek and docile and perfect. They are not in control of their emotions in the way that adults are. They get tired and sick and cranky and sad, and they have to be potty trained. They don't, come out of the womb these perfect, spotless creatures, which can then be trigger points that the abuser uses against both the child and the adult victim to disparage the adult victim's parenting. If it wasn't for you, if you were a better mother, if you were a better father, you would have them cleaned up and they wouldn't be filthy all the time, and you parented better, they would obey better, things like that. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have the jealous, controlling perpetrator who cannot understand or fathom the adult victim's attention being on anything or anyone but them. And so, for instance, if the child wakes up in the middle of the night crying because they need to be fed, the abuser may physically prevent the victim, the adult victim, from leaving the bedroom to feed the child. They may hurt them so that they can't leave the bedroom. They may lock them in. They may pin them down, and causes the child to be routinely neglected, routinely abused in that way over time, because, again, the perpetrator is still controlling everything that happens with the child. They're just controlling it by making sure it is withheld. And again, then you may also have the infantilization of the non-offending parent. As a piece of the control, even without children present in a relationship, abusers may often talk down to their partners. They talk to their partners as if they are children or pets or possessions. They often punish their partners as if they are children, essentially grounding them, giving them physical corporal punishments, withholding. And so that continues on even when there is a child in the home. The batterer will talk down to the parent. The batterer will speak as if they are stupid, as if they are children themselves. And that obviously a byproduct of that is that the non-offending parent is then becomes a lesser person, or becomes a less of an authority figure, less of a parent in the eyes of the child. And on that, that side of the continuum where the perpetrator is preventing the victim from parenting, preventing by or controlling by withholding, you also have this necessity to focus and put your focus and time and energy on the abuser in order to both survive and de-escalate violent incidents. So many victims are forced by their need to appease or diffuse or prevent violence in the home by putting all of their focus on the perpetrator and putting the perpetrator's needs before anything. This puts the victims in an impossible situation because obviously you can't both meet an abusive partner's demands and make the choices necessary for good parenting. But often the choice is made in order to prevent the perpetrator from enacting more violence in the home, and specifically from enacting violence against the child. If I am a victim, is totally focused on anticipating your every need, then you won't need to pay attention to the child and the child's behavior and focus any of your aggression or intention there. Now again, when we swing back to that other end of the spectrum, where the child is a possession that reflects on the perpetrator's public persona and public perception, you may see a lot of performative parenting that is used to both garner outside support and to alienate the non-offending parent. So you may see things like lots of pictures posted on social media that dad took us out to play paintball and go-karts, for instance. And what you may not see behind the scenes is that this is just one more control tactic. So for instance, this is a way that a perpetrator can gain support from the child while alienating the non-offending parent. So, for instance, if I am the perpetrator and I'm telling the children all week, on Saturday we're going to get ice cream and we're going to the park. On Saturday we're going to get ice cream and we're going to the park. And I've gotten everybody really excited about this trip to get ice cream and go to the park. And Saturday morning rolls around and we're in the kitchen getting ready for breakfast, and I'm not going with somebody who acts the way you do. I'm not going with somebody who starts fights all the time. And I storm off, and the children are devastated because now we have no money for rent. We have no money to pay the power bill. It's coming up on the first of the month. He's already maxed out the credit cards. We've got barely enough money to buy groceries. And he wakes up on Saturday morning and says, "Come on, kids, we're going to paintball and go-karts." And they're so excited and so happy, and he takes them out to paintball and go-karts, and he takes a million pictures, and the kids are thrilled. And on Monday at school, that's all they're talking about, is that they got to go to paintball and go-karts. Meanwhile, what the victim knows is that the money spent on paintball and go-karts was what should have barely been able to buy them groceries for the month. But any fight that might then be started about that, any time that they might bring it up, any objection that the victim might have, becomes, you're a bad parent, you don't want me having fun with the kids, you're trying to make the kids hate me, why can't you just have a little fun, why are you blaming me when your job is to do the grocery shopping, and if we don't have any groceries, then it's your fault. So easy to see how this manipulation works while still convincing potentially the children and family and teachers and people who are on the outside looking in that the perpetrator is this fun, active, happy father. And they use that public reputation and public persona to build support for themselves. So for instance, let's say this same couple then has a parent-teacher conference, this annual parent-teacher conference on Tuesday, and they're driving to the school for the parent-teacher conference. It's the afternoon after work, and the non-offending parent and the abuser are in the car, and they're driving and they get almost to the school when the perpetrator snaps and just starts berating the victim. You're a terrible person. You're a terrible mother. My children aren't going to have enough food to eat this month because you couldn't do the one thing that's your job and do the grocery shopping. You never treat the children right. You don't know how to discipline them. If we get in this meeting and they tell me that little Johnny got in another fight, you should know that it's your fault. And, you're lucky that I don't file for divorce and take custody of those kids, because if I did that, you would never see them again. And the victim is in tears and shaking, and they get to the school and they park in the parking lot, and the abuser just turns it off. And the victim has to wipe their tears and try to take a deep breath and get themselves together and make themselves presentable. And they've become kind of an expert on this by then. So once they get into the school, you can't really tell by looking that the victim has been crying. But what you may see as the teacher is one parent, the perpetrator, who is charming and smiling and laughing and very personable and seems very interested and engaged in their child's schooling. And you may see the other parent, the victim, who is frowning or looks angry, is withdrawn, is silent, seems bored because they keep looking at the clock, seems uninterested because they keep fidgeting. And so you are left with the impression that they have one very engaged and personable parent and one parent who doesn't care about schooling. And you have been manipulated, just like many people around the abuser is manipulated. There's a form of gaslighting. The idea that you can shape someone's perceptions by denying their reality or making them question their memory. So, for instance, when it's done toward a victim, it may be things like, I never did that. I don't know what you're talking about. You've just been so angry all the time lately, and you're picking all these fights. And you know what? I talked to your mom on the phone the other night, and even she's worried about you and doesn't understand what's going on in your head. Making you think that you're the one in the wrong, or that you're the one who's misremembering what's happening in the relationship. This can also be used against the children. The example that I gave earlier about canceling the ice cream trip and blaming it on the non-offending parent. but also things like if the children are upstairs and the parents are downstairs, perpetrators have an almost uncanny ability to hone in on the weakest points of the victim and dig into those and exploit them. So for instance, things like, I'm going to take the kids away and you'll never see them again. And so the perpetrator may start a fight and escalate it with all of these horrible things, but it may be the perpetrator speaking in a very low, angry, menacing voice, and the victim yelling and screaming to try to get their point across, or out of anger, out of fear, out of overwhelm. If the children are upstairs, they may not be able to hear what the perpetrator is saying at all, so all they can understand of the situation that they're hearing is that they're hearing the non-offending parent screaming and yelling and being angry, right? Abusers are consistent in holding beliefs that relieve them of responsibility for their abusiveness. They're great at justifying. They're great at defending and excusing and explaining their points of view. So let's say that this fight is happening where mom or non-offending parent is yelling and the perpetrator is talking low and angry, and the kiddo comes down the stairs to see what's going on and walks into the room, and the non-offending parent immediately knows, I need to get them out of here. I need to get them out of here. They don't need to see or hear what the perpetrator is saying. They don't need to be in the line of fire, so to speak. I don't want them to get caught up in anything if there's a violent incident. And the only thing that you know to do in that moment of heightened emotion and fear and upset is to snap at and yell at the victim or the child, go to your room, get out of here, I don't want to hear it right now, go to your room. And later on, the perpetrator may go up to the child and say, you know, I'm really sorry that mom yelled at you earlier. You know, she's having a really hard time right now, and you know, she shouldn't have done that, and I'm trying to get her help, but, you know, I'm sorry that she's being a bad mom. All of this is to create a certain image, a certain picture of the perpetrator. And all of this is reinforced by these societal stereotypes and acceptance of this idea of possessive love. We see it all the time in entertainment, media, movies, TVs, books, where things like possessiveness, obsession, stalking behaviors are all seen as symbols that someone really loves you, right? And we are not, none of us, even folks who are in this field, we are not immune from these messages of possessive love. You know, when I searched for an image to put on this slide, when I searched for possessive love and possessive relationships, 99% of the images that came up were positive, that possessiveness, obsession in relationships was a good thing. And then if someone is a possession, if you see someone as belonging to you or as an extension of you and of your public persona, then it is easy to see them as things, as items that you can do with as you see fit. So there comes authoritarian discipline styles, very extraordinarily isolating and strict parenting tactics that, again, the perpetrator believes are perfectly normal or warranted. They will deny, minimize, and blame the victim with their very last breath. That, again, if I didn't love you so much, I wouldn't have done this. You just make me upset. You made me do this. I would never do what you're saying that I did because I love you so much. And so all of the performative aspects, the gaslighting, the possessive love, the authoritarianism all come together in this idea that I wouldn't be hurting you if I didn't love you. And even if I did hurt you, it's your fault for making me do it. And out of that comes children who digest the view that the victim is to blame for how they're treated because either they started the fight or they were the one who was yelling, they're the one who's upset all the time. Again, it's very similar to the example I gave you of the parent-teacher conference. If the child sees one parent who seems fine, you know, unless there's an incident, unless there's a trigger, but otherwise they seem happy, joking, jovial, and another parent who seems always tense, always on edge, always upset, always walking on eggshells, they may not have the ability to see the complexity of the situation and understand why those behaviors are happening. 80% of abused mothers reported that the abuser has used their children as pawns. 50% reported that he's done so often. And again, I mentioned earlier the idea of disordered attachment, role reversals, having the child who is the perfect child or having the child who is the child who's acting out. So a lot of these children may adopt these kind of pseudo-adult caretaker roles where they feel like they have to care for their younger siblings, where they feel like they have to care for the victim, they're the one who has to cook dinner, maybe even feel like they're the ones who have to care for the abuser because the abuser demands all of that focus and all of that attention. The abuser's assistant, as we talked about earlier, the child who either learns the aggressive behaviors or is egged on purposefully by the abusers. Of the scapegoat, the child who feels like everything is their responsibility. These are often the neglected children. They are the ones who are isolated and who feel like they are to blame. And then you have that perfect child, the one who's trying to get all A's, who is trying to use perfection as a tool to control what's happening around them. And they may see their younger siblings misbehaving or attribute abuse and violent outbursts by the abuser as the fault of the non-offending parent or the fault of one of the other children in the home because they weren't being good or being perfect enough to prevent it. Abusers also have a really great impact on children's belief systems in terms of believing that victims are to blame for violence, that violence is justified, that boys and men are in control, that abusers don't experience consequences, that victims are weak, incompetent, stupid, or violent, that anger causes violence. But we know that children also have a great capacity for resilience. And abusers can impact that resilience in a lot of ways, but one of the big ones, again, comes from that isolation. They are isolated both within the home from having a truly healthy and truly attached relationship with that non-offending parent. They're also often isolated outside the home from forming attachments with other safe and healthy adults and attachments with peers. And then there is what happens when a separation happens. I already mentioned that one of the most dangerous times in the victim's life, the time where they are most likely to be killed by the perpetrator, is when they're trying to leave or in the immediate aftermath of leaving. There's the increased danger to the victim. The abuser's parenting style may become more pronounced in times of visitation because the victim is not there to be a buffer or a distraction. There is increased undermining of the non-offending parent because, again, the victim is not there. So the abuser will often say terrible things and take their frustration out in that way. There is a potential for continued DV exposure because we know that oftentimes perpetrators don't stop with just one victim. Most people who perpetrate DV perpetrate it serially until there is outside intervention. And again, abusers are more likely to fight for sole or primary custody, but it's not all bad because it has an overall positive impact on the victim's parenting. And that makes sense because they're finally able to focus the time and attention and energy toward their children and their relationship with the children, and do not have to be constantly kind of walking on eggshells in the home. And again, just a note to show how all of this is kind of interwoven, because of all of that performative parenting, because of the manipulation, the abusers may have developed reputations as excellent parents and may have a lot of people within the school, even within the community, within the family, as sort of character witnesses for them when it comes to divorce and custody issues. And because we know that domestic violence is one of the most underreported crimes, maybe second only to sexual assault, many victims who cite domestic violence during their divorce may be labeled as attempting parental alienation. So these are all kind of refreshers to note that the tactics, the gaslighting, the performative parenting, the manipulation, and victim blaming, they extend well after the abuser and the victim have separated into, custody and visitation disputes. And it is also really important to note that perpetrators will often use courts and litigation as forms of abuse. So one of the cases that I worked on with the fatality review, this victim and perpetrator separated and divorced just after the child was born. The perpetrator sought and was granted primary custody of the child, and still the perpetrator filed motion after motion after motion and dragged the victim into court over and over and over again for 18 years, just as a method NOP, sorry, I just saw this pop up on my screen. NOP, a non-offending parent. That is, a parent that is not engaging in abusive tactics. But yes, so litigation can be used, the court system can be used as a tool of the abuser. And just to note, in terms of, safer at home orders, we are seeing between 30 and 50% less child abuse reports during this time in Tennessee, primarily because children are not seeing people like teachers, coaches, church members, grandparents who may otherwise be the most likely to report abuse. So it's very concerning, very upsetting, and I really encourage that if you are someone who has an existing relationship with children, that you think of ways that you might be able to check in with them, whether that be through Skype or something like that, or dropping off things like care packages if this is a family that you're actually close to and that wouldn't be weird or concerning. And if you want more information about kind of safety planning with COVID-19 or the impact, I have a website on the screen right here that can give you more information specifically about that topic. But people are doing really creative things like on social media saying, if you find yourself at home in an abusive situation, message me, ask about eyeliner. That'll be our keyword. That way, if the perpetrator looks at your messages, they won't see anything suspicious, but I'll know that means I need to either check in on you or call the authorities. And they may be, not seeing their primary care physician as often, or if they are going into a doctor's office, they may not be getting as much face-to-face time. So this is another creative way that someone came up with, initial in black, but if you initial in red, we who work here will know something's wrong and will know to ask you about it, but the perpetrator won't know the difference. So how do we support healing? Really, the primary thing is thinking about the ways that we can help repair and support the relationship between the non-offending parent and child. Those positive parent-child relationships are vital to resilience. Helping the parents, the non-offending parent, learn how to speak to the child in age-appropriate ways. Helping them, giving lots of reassurance, giving lots of communication. But what's really important to note, and what I really want to leave you with, is that when victims learn about the impact of domestic violence, they are able to parent better. We are not born understanding how our choices impact those around us. And oftentimes, like I said, the choices that are being made by that non-offending parent in the relationship are choices that they think are preventing or mitigating or protecting the child from violence. So we have to be able to talk about and educate people on these impacts. So the last couple of slides are just things that you can say to victims, additional resources, and you will receive these slides. So I'm not going to belabor them. We will send out these slides so you'll have all this stuff. The last thing is just remember that the batter's abuse of the children's mother or father should be seen as reflecting on his and her or her parenting. You can be a person who has never harmed your child in any way, but if you are abusing the other parent, that should be seen as reflecting on your parenting. So again, I've got some recommendations, but we'll send these out. One thing that I do want to say is if you're interested in specifically the COVID-19 impact on custody, there is a webinar from the Battered Women's Justice Project this Thursday. So if you're interested, they always do wonderful webinars. Any final questions? We will try to answer as many as we can, and like I said, if we can't answer them, or if you feel like you have something that you want to talk about in more depth, or that you don't feel like you can ask on the webinar, you can email me anytime, and I'm happy to answer or point you in the right direction as best I can. And again, remember to type your questions in the chat box, not the Q&A box.
Thank you, Heather. We do have some questions already. And just so folks be mindful of time, if you need to get off of the call now, the presentation is over, but we will continue to ask Heather questions that have been coming in. The first question is, I work mostly with male clients who are survivors. What statistics or information do you have on adult male survivors as a domestic violence and or survivors of sexual abuse and female perpetrators? The example, forced to penetrate.
Yeah, that could be a whole webinar in and of itself. It's such an important and challenging topic. One of my favorite organizations that works specifically with male survivors is 1 in 6. If you're not familiar with them, I highly recommend them. They're a wonderful organization led by male survivors, created for male survivors that have a lot of really good information.
Thank you. And does the next question, does the power and control wheel and understanding of IPV mechanisms in general hold true for cases of female perpetrators or same-sex couples, or are there differences?
That's a great question. So it's kind of a yes and question. So all of the tactics that you see, so all of the headings on that power and control wheel, like using children, isolation, those kind of things are present across the board in these relationships, whether it is a female perpetrator, whether it's a same-gender relationship. The only one that does change, obviously, is that using male privilege, but often that is twisted sort of, especially in situations with a female perpetrator and a male victim, that using male privilege is twisted on its head so that the female perpetrator will say things like, you know, no one's going to believe you because who's going to believe that a man could be abused by a woman, right? So it's kind of twisted upside down. But there are obviously differences in the ways that those tactics are used depending on the dynamics of the relationship. So there is a power and control wheel for male victims, and there is an LGBT power and control wheel. And you can Google both of those. You can Google power and control wheel male victim and Google power and control wheel LGBT, and those will come up and give you kind of ideas of the very specific tactics, the way that the tactics are used among those different dynamics.
Thank you. Next question, do statistics show that the majority of abusers were raised in a home with domestic violence issues?
So this is an interesting question, and it's important to know that yes, most abusers do have a background of abuse, but it is also important to note that most children who grow up with violence in their homes do not go on to become abusers. So I hope that makes sense. Only a small minority of children who grow up with violence in their homes become abusers themselves, but abusers predominantly come from those types of backgrounds.
Thank you. And then how can you intervene without concrete evidence against the perpetrator?
That's a great question, and it's such an important question, and so I'm glad that you asked. It particularly when you suspect abuse in a home with children or child abuse, it is important to know two things. Number one, every adult person in the state of Tennessee is a mandated reporter. And number two, you are protected as long as your report is in good faith. And so what that means is even if you don't have some kind of concrete proof that you feel like the DA could come in and say, great job, junior detective, you know, we're going to take this from here. That's not really your job. Your job is not necessarily to gather all this proof. If you have a legitimate belief and suspicion that this is happening in a home, and you make a report and it turns out that you were wrong, you're protected. You're okay. There's not a legal backlash that can come. So it's always better to report when you suspect that this is happening. And the people who are tasked with then investigating and getting more proof, then they'll get involved, right? So if you see something that makes you think, you know, something's wrong here, I always, you know, err on the side of reporting because that's our duty, and, you know, that's how we as neighbors and citizens keep each other safe.
Thank you. And I apologize. Before a lot of folks get off, Christy, if you want to come on and share closing remarks. I should have done that before. I'll share this comment while Christy's jumping on, but this was a comment, but I thought it was neat. It goes back to the markers, the different colored markers, and just so folks can reach out without verbalizing it, but that they had seen that you ask about soap if it involves children. Excuse me, you can ask about soap, or if it involves children, to ask them about bubble bath.
Yeah, those are great ideas. Anytime that you can, you know, get really creative, especially during this time where we're not face-to-face with folks, where our interactions are primarily digital, you can get really creative in the ways that we are connecting and looking out for each other. So thank you for that suggestion. I love that.
Christy?
Yes. Well, thank you, Heather, so much for the phenomenal presentation. Such important information. We so appreciate you being here with us today. On behalf of all the regional coordinators, we'd like to thank you for joining us and look forward to seeing you again for future offerings. Many of you may have also registered for the effects of trauma on the brain and body. We will be fortunate to again have Heather as our presenter, and that's tomorrow morning beginning at 9 a.m. The psychological effect of social distancing and quarantine on children with guest speaker Dr. Tim Perry will be May 11th. Both of these offerings have reached capacity for registration. However, they will be recorded. Our contact information from TCCY is visible on the screen now. And as a reminder, you will be receiving an email next week with certificates along with membership information about joining our local councils. So once again, if you are calling in, please email me, Christy Paling, with your name and phone number if you need a participant or a CEU certificate. So again, thank you everyone for joining us and have a great day.
Christy, do you mind to go ahead and just spell out your email for folks that are on the call?
It is christy.paling@tn.gov. And all of you should have received an email from me with the WebEx link on Friday. So you should have my email in your list. So again, thank you very much.
And Christy, I just want to clarify, I think the webinar tomorrow is at 1 p.m. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Sorry for the confusion, everyone. Didn't want to put you into a panic there. And thank you, Heather, for clarifying that. Yes, it will begin at 1 p.m. and that's Central Time, 2 p.m. Eastern Time. So again, thank you, Heather.
Absolutely.
And I'll turn it back over to you for if there's any additional questions that you can answer.
We do have additional questions, but also we will in the slides as we send out certificates. If you registered for a CEU certificate on Eventbrite, those we will send you a CEU certificate by next week. We've just had several of those questions. Okay, Heather. Next question. Do you find the abusers are generally aware of their own manipulation tactics and applying them consciously? Or is it just something that is organically pathological within them?
I think by and large, they are aware and very methodical and purposeful in their manipulations. I do think there are certain pathologies that are common among abusive individuals, and those may, like the question asker mentioned, come along with some of those manipulative behaviors that are not necessarily as that are sometimes, we're unaware of. But I think by and large, and I think the research bears out that by and large, this is a purposeful, deliberate action.
Thank you. And help and resources for the abusers outside of anger management. What are the help and resources outside of the anger management?
Anger management, let me just make a blanket statement. Anger management is not particularly effective or impactful for an abusive individual. That is not what it's meant for. So oftentimes we we think that, or in our minds, we kind of think that anger management and batterers intervention programs are the same thing, but they are not. They're two very different systems, and batterers intervention programs are crafted specifically to address abusive interpersonal behaviors. That being said, I do believe that the most important intervention is always going to be mental health care.
Thank you. Did you state that reports of domestic violence had gone down 30%?
That's a great question. So Reports of child abuse have gone down 30 to 50%. Reports of domestic violence are actually going up slightly.
Do you think part of that is due to the quarantine and?
I do. Obviously, you know, we don't have any research that bears that out, but the only change is the quarantine. So I think it's safe to say people are trapped in their homes more and more with their abusers. And so I think that is why we're seeing an increase in calls. And whether that will continue as the kind of lockdown situations continue, I don't know, but it certainly has stayed pretty steady thus far.
Okay, thank you. And then there was a comment about the Twilight, and just wondering if there was one of the primary examples you saw in your Google search for possessive relationships.
That is an excellent example and a common example, but I definitely do not want to leave the impression that that's the only example. There is a lot of media, particularly media geared toward teenagers and young adults, that use kind of those possessive, obsessive love tropes on TV and in movies and books. So Twilight is an example most people know, but it's super, super pervasive.
Okay, thank you. Excuse me. And and the last question, if you report and then investigators do not find enough evidence, will it increase the chance of more abuse after the investigators leave?
It can. It won't always, but it definitely can be a trigger. That being said, I never want folks to come away thinking they shouldn't report, particularly reporting child abuse, because I think it's so important to, the more reports that happen, the more likely something is to be taken seriously. But yes, that can be a trigger. And, you know, honestly, it is hard to anticipate all of the triggers that exist for perpetrators. So
I think that's all the questions that we have. And just a couple of housekeeping questions about slides and recordings. This session has been recorded, and folks have asked how they will access the recording. So we have a couple of different ways. If you registered this morning, or as you registered, you submitted your email address, so we know you have attended this session. We will email those a link to the recording. It will be uploaded to our YouTube. So we will be sending slide certificates and a link for the recording for this session out when we get those out. We just finished with a session on Friday and have another one tomorrow. So we do ask for your grace and patience for us to get all of those out, because we are managing several. So, for no questions, ask one more time if there were any other questions. We will close this out. Again, Heather, thank you so much. You do a phenomenal job.
Yes, thank you, Heather.
thank
And
you.
thank you all for joining us once again.
Thank you.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye, Heather.